Test, that's good. Sound is still good from yesterday, thankfully. Okay, so today we are continuing in Genesis and Matthew. So if you remember, we've been looking at the sort of that broad arc of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so we are continuing on with Jacob. And then in Matthew, we are looking at more parables about seeds and growth and all that kind of stuff. In fact, for the next 2 weeks, we continue to look at seeds and growth, following up on yesterday. So as we get started, I'd like us to open with prayer, but I want to do something a little bit different today. I'd like to use a sort of a repetitive chant as that prayer from that is used often in the Taizé community, which is a community of ecumenical men living in France, that they hold retreats, and they have a type of prayer that focuses on this kind of meditative chant, listening to the word and moving in and out of silence from that chant. So if you go ahead and close your eyes and join me in prayer. Surely God is in this place, holy ground. 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 God, we ask that you would show us your face in this place, in this holy ground, that we find you in the scriptures and in our lives. Grant us that vision and assurance that you are with us. Surely God is in this place, holy ground. Surely God is in this place, holy ground. Amen. So, yeah, that's one of those ones that catches me too. So, anyway. We'll see what we can do. It's sort of, that was sort of inspired by the Genesis passage. So anyway, why don't we jump in with that Genesis passage, which we start in Genesis 28, chapter 28, verse 10, and going into verse 19, the first part of verse 19. 28, verse 10. Genesis 28, verse 10. Yes, 28, verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised." Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel. So just giving you a little bit of context, last week we ended up reading about Isaac and Jacob and Esau being born, and how, Jacob was holding on to Esau's heel as he came out, and then, Jacob tricking Esau into giving up his birthright for a bowl of lentils because he was going to die. He was so famished. And then what we didn't hear is that in the meantime, Isaac becomes old and can't see, and he's sort of like, okay, I'm getting close to death, and so have Esau come in so I can give him my blessing. Well, Jacob is told by Rebekah, "Hey, your dad's getting close to dying. Put on this, this sheepskin so that you're all hairy on the chest, and then go, take him this game stew and let him eat that and get the blessing." And so Jacob gets the blessing from Isaac that was meant for Esau. And so all of this stuff is going on, and Esau finds out about this, and he's angry, and he consoles himself by saying, "Yeah, I'm going to kill him as soon as the mourning for my dad is over. As soon as my dad dies and the period of mourning, he's toast. Jacob is toast." And so Rachel gets wind of this, tells Jacob, "Okay, you need to skedaddle now." And she convinces Isaac to tell Jacob, "Go back to, your mother's family and get a wife there." And so that's the excuse for him getting out of town. And so here we have him leaving, and this is the trip that he's taking on the way. So that's where our reading picks up. So what are your first thoughts and questions as we listen to this scripture passage for today? Yeah.
The stone that he uses for a pillow
Uh-huh.
seems curious. Why would he choose a stone? Why not some shrubs or something?
Yeah, I don't know why the stone.
These things, because
Yeah.
the stone treats it almost as though it's some kind of a something.
Yeah, I mean it's a plush pillow. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that folks actually had many pillows back in those days. Because if you remember, there are some pictures of these wooden stands with the curved thing, so that you'd lay with that underneath your neck. I don't get it. It doesn't sound comfortable. But it's still a stone that's what the story says. And maybe it's he's a side sleeper and it's to keep the head a little bit more propped up. I don't know. I haven't slept out in the wilderness of around Bethel.
Well, he puts oil on.
Well, and that's afterwards. It's sort of like, okay, this is where I had this dream, and so I'm going to anoint this to show the holiness of it. Yeah. What?
I said that's
Probably why he had the dream. Couldn't sleep well because he had a stone under his head. That was the problem, that he was awake with that. What else?
Is that for the same, excuse me, of somebody in sheep's clothing?
A wolf in sheep's clothing? No, that's a different parable, but that's Aesop's fables that talk about that. But no, this was Jacob and Rebekah pulling a fast one. Another fast one. This happens repeatedly.
Where's Herod located?
Where is Aram located? Or Haran? Haran. It's sort of north of Baghdad. It's in that. It would probably be in the same area that would be the Kurdish area of Iraq.
Which would almost be the center of civilization at that point in time.
It would be close, yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
That's where we get the north, east, south, and west of the spreading of.
Yeah, yeah. So this is, this is a continuation. So one of the things that's going on is this is a continuation of the promise that God made to Abraham. Go from your people and go to the place that I show you, and I will give it to you, and you will become great, and your descendants will be greater than the grains of sand on the shore. And so that's what we're seeing, is that promise was passed on to Isaac, and now it's passed on to Jacob, which is somewhat interesting because it's the younger son rather than the older son that's being passed on to. So that becomes sort of interesting. But it's still, it's that continuation that we talked about, where this whole arc of the story with Jacob is that the people that aren't as strong, that aren't as large, are able to trick and have that power over those rivals, when usually the world would think that's not the case. Again, this is the people of Israel when they're living in the shadow of Egypt and the Assyrian Empire, or the Babylonian Empire, or whoever the empire is to the north. So, Ellie?
I hate to say this, but it sounds like God is almost promoting the devious, the dishonest.
Yeah, it's almost like God is promoting the devious, the dishonest, the people that are, underneath and tricksters. And so, yeah, it's sort of like, what's going on here? Why is this happening? It is disturbing, and if we look at the gospel, there's sort of a continuation of it. Who does Jesus tend to favor? Not the religious authorities, not the people in power, but the weaker, the meek, the poor, those who mourn. I mean, think about the Sermon on the Mount. It's that same twisting, but there's not the dishonesty and the
It's
so.
the dishonesty that bothers me.
Right.
The wrongness aspect
Right.
of it rather than
Right.
cause and the have-not.
But God is definitely on the side of the underdog here, even if they are a trickster. And there is that dishonesty in Abraham as well. I mean, if we go back, we listen to Abraham. Abraham has to go down to Egypt because there's a famine, and he tells Sarah, "Tell him you're my sister, because I don't want them to kill me so they can take you as as their wife." And so they do, and they end up getting a plague on themselves because of that. So there is still that dishonesty and trickster, and I think it actually happens twice that Abraham does that. Says, "Tell him you're my sister rather than my wife." And so Abraham isn't always that upright, upstanding citizen. He's lying and cheating to protect himself.
So, part of God's creation, in other words, he really created that aspect of humanity.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, it's at least in, I want to say endorsed, but it's something that God is able to use. I don't know whether it's God is saying, yes, this is what you should be doing or not. I'm not sure I would go there, but it's complex. I mean, the story is complex. The personalities are complex. It's not that here's this upstanding citizen that we're going to be, singing his praises about everything, because no, he does just that, and then, we'll find out later, in the next few weeks, where, his uncle tricks him, and then he in turn tricks his uncle back. And so it becomes sort of this, dishonest, family feud that's not quite, up and up.
When you think about it, maybe that's what keeps the story going. Everything was very pure and proper and simple. And
Right. It doesn't make for an interest.
boring.
Yeah, it would be a boring story. And there's still, from my perspective, there's still that endorsement of the underdog, even if some of the stuff they're pulling isn't kosher. So anyway,
What
Art?
do you mean by all people on earth will be blessed through you and your office?
Yeah. So.
Give me an example of that.
So all people and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Or I have a note say, or all people, all families of the earth shall bless themselves in you and in your offspring. So there's a slight question about how you translate that, but it still gives that same impression that people are blessed because of the descendants of Jacob. Now, we have, there are several ways to interpret that. Jewish people would say we're the chosen people. God has chosen us to bring, salvation to the world, to show God to the world. Christians would say Jesus is a descendant of Jacob, and that is that primary path that blessing has come to all the earth. And so so Christians would say that blessing that comes to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants spreads to the entire world through Jesus the Christ, who God was planned to bring into existence for the salvation of the world. So that would be a traditional Christian interpretation. I would say that we need to have both to talk about the people of Israel as well being that blessing to help. But I would definitely affirm that Jesus is that main conduit. I don't want to move into a place called supersessionism, where we say, well, the Jewish people are no longer part of the covenant because Christianity has superseded it. That is some of the same thought, that same line of thinking that led to the Holocaust. And I don't want to endorse that. So.
But as to Ellie's point, it seems like in this soap opera thing we have going here, this is a lot of not nice things going on. How does God put up with it and still go along with
Yeah.
the word?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right, Richard, in saying that this is a soap opera. It absolutely is. But yeah, and I would say the exact same thing. Yeah, you're exactly right, Art, that it shows that God will work with us even in our flaws, because all of us have our flaws. All of us have those points that we are not, it might not be that we're lying and cheating the same way as Jacob does, but there are points that we are not living up to what God would have us do. And so this shows God will still work with flawed individuals as God chooses to.
But forgiveness only comes with Jesus.
But forgiveness only comes with Jesus. Maybe. I'm not sure that, Jesus, I would agree that forgiveness and resurrection comes through Jesus. And I'm not sure that this requires forgiveness
I
from.
don't think there's any I think it's just being ignored.
It's being ignored. And it could be that it's being ignored, but it also can be that these are complex human beings that are a mixture of good and bad, that have flaws as well as wonderful, attributes. Because what we hear here is, even though Jacob is running away from his brother's anger because of what he's done. I would say righteous anger, but maybe anger taken a little too far. There's still that point where he's able to understand something different in this moment, that there's a spiritual nature to him, that he's open to seeing, Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. Yeah. I mean, this is where that comes from, but it's this, here are the heavens opened up, and he's really fearful. But he also recognizes this is a holy place. And surely God is in this place. And he ends up setting this up, and the city eventually becomes known as Bethel, which in Hebrew, Beit means house, El means God. So this is house of God. So Bethel is the house of God here. So that's and so this becomes an important center of worship for the people of Israel, for Jacob's descendants. So, Ellie?
If God is kind of planning the story, so to speak, he sees things that are gonna advance more, and he sees more possibility with Jacob than he does with the other one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely that, there's the possibility that God is saying, okay, there's more ability to change and be open to something else with Jacob than there is with Esau, that there's more ability to go in the direction that I want. I mean, each of us, has those potentials, and right, exactly. And, Esau is a hothead, and it doesn't really, understand some of the gifts and value that he's been given, and Jacob knows what he's going after, but he does it in underhanded ways. So, exactly, that's the question.
Sounds like Jacob.
Yeah, it sounds like Jacob's worse, and there's part of this that is foreshadowing of the people of Israel when they are in the land, of how they're having to sort of navigate, this little kingdom on the border of superpowers of the day. How do they make it through when there's the threat of the Assyrians coming in, taking over, and there's a threat of the Egyptians coming in and taking over? How do you manage those different regional politics?
Why was there always a threat?
Why?
Wouldn't it be like Sweden getting along with Finland, and like most countries in Europe?
Because that understanding of a nation state hadn't developed yet. That understanding of, here are our borders. That, I mean, it was sort of like, in the Roman times, it was always fuzzy. Where is the border? Well, we're going to put it at this river because it's defensible. But you don't have those large, landmarks. I mean, if you look, the best understanding of national borders for this kind of time is the border between Oman and Saudi Arabia. If you look on a map, it's a dashed line, because Oman and Saudi Arabia are sort of like, that's wilderness, that's desert, there's nothing there. So we'll say it's somewhere around here, but we aren't really concerned about what the demarcation is. It's similar to this, that what the territorial lines are not spelled out in treaties. There's not treaties saying, we will go from this point to this point to this point and this point, and then the stuff on that side is your land and the stuff on this side is our land. That is not comprehensible at this point. That doesn't come along until we look at the Middle Ages. And so this idea of threat, well, empires just want to expand. And the people of Israel are trying to just hold their own at that point.
How do we not take this decision by God to work with one and not the other as God's favoritism?
how do we not take this as God playing favorites? Well, yeah, look at David. I mean, there's David and Saul. I mean, so God does have favorites. God does say, this is going to advance my plan better. So
How do we fit into this? Does that mean that
there are people that are preferred.
better than I am or whatever?
Well, Marty, we all know that you're Roman Catholic, so everyone, you're definitely more preferred than everyone else. I mean, we know that that's how this works. Yeah. And so I think I think that that's one of those places that we've had to work at reimagining, re-understanding that, these stories have a soap opera feel, and it's trying to push a particular point. It's trying to understand how have we as a people come to this preferred place. And so there's has to be choices along the way, because we hear about Esau being called Edom, so the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. How are they not co-owners of the land of Canaan? How is it just the descendants of Jacob, the Israelites? How do they become the path that the blessing goes through? How is it that it's Isaac and not Ishmael that path comes through? And so there's trying to figure this out, and with time and from my perspective, further revelation, we hear Jesus talk about going out and making disciples of all nations, and that becomes a blessing. So it's no longer about one favored people to bring the story, but it's that we're trying to spread it to all people, that all people participate in the story, that all people have a part in it. And so it's not a favored situation. This is why I won't pray for the Packers. I mean, Lord knows they need prayers, but but it's sort of on game days, it's not that important. So, Patty?
So, being Catholic, you don't get a free pass.
Being Catholic, you don't get a free pass. No, you just get a whole bunch of guilt.
So seriously, my question is, initially with the reading, we are a disappointment to God. We have failed.
Mhm.
So with that, we will never know how we are not a disappointment until the end of our journey. Is that right?
So-
we will never know.
So you're saying that, when we look at this, Jacob is definitely a disappointment, that he's acting unethically. And so we all, by extension, are that kind of disappointment. And I'm not sure that I'd say that, because Jacob doesn't get this word of disappointment here. Jacob gets the promise of God's faithfulness even after he's pulled fast ones, even when he's going to pull further fast ones, because eventually we're going to get to the point that Jacob is there wrestling with God, and gets renamed as Israel, which means one who struggles with an L. That L at the end means God. So one who struggles with God. So there's this aspect that it's not your disappointment, but I'm still working with you, even with these flaws. And so I think that there's, because, I will give to you and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and spread spread abroad, east, west, north, and south, and be a blessing to the world, and know that I'm with you and will keep you wherever you go and bring you back to this land. So it's not just disappointment, but there's God's faithfulness that's still here. And I think that becomes one of the key points of this, that even in all the flaws, God's blessing, God's care remains. And that's part, I think, of the awe that we hear when Jacob says, I'm going to set up this pillar here. take the stone that my head rested upon and anoint it and make it an altar to God, because God has shown God's faithfulness even in this moment that I should be despairing. I mean, he's running away from his brother, and God's still faithful.
Going back to the lack of a nation states, where there was no borders and so on, we had other gods though that people were worshiping back in those days.
Mhm.
I mean, who knows how many there were? Wasn't God, no matter what, trying to elect or select whatever the strongest one to spread the word? Is that the idea here?
God wasn't trying to select the strongest one to spread the word. God was choosing a people that God chose. And part of it is God is not choosing the strongest, the best, the most military, or the
I wouldn't think it that way, as it was one that could spread the word.
right. And the people of Israel weren't really the best folks to spread that. They just weren't. What ended up happening, I mean, and the people of Israel weren't necessarily spreading that, but what happened after Jesus, came and made this radical shift in Judaism that became Christianity, that word started to spread beyond the local confines of Palestine and into the rest of the Roman Empire, and it took off. And the Roman Empire allowed that, but it wasn't the Roman Empire that was encouraging that, at least not until the time of Constantine. It was almost as if Christianity was subverting and using the power of the Roman Empire to get that message spread further, because the way that the political situation of the Roman Empire was, you could safely travel between all these different lands that were occupied by the Roman legions. And so it's not the strongest that are being here. It's the weakness. It's the lesser, the unexpected places. And that becomes one of the principles of Christianity, that in my weakness, that's where God is shown. In my flaws, that's where God's grace is revealed. And Jacob is finding this in this time. Jacob is finding God was here and I didn't know it. Surely God is in this place and it's holy ground. And I didn't realize it. And I think that can be our mantra too. That in our weakness, in those places that we think that God's not there, boom, heaven is opened. And here's this ladder going up to heaven with angels ascending and descending.
So that even when this concept of good and bad and so forth, there's always basically behind it the concept of hope.
Yeah.
So that, no, we don't know whether we're the one chosen, but there's hope.
Right. And Christians would say, no, we are chosen because we are chosen in Christ. In Christ, Christ is the one that's chosen, and when we're baptized into him, we become part of that. And so,
And that then gives us
the hope, yes,
the hope in our
absolutely.
faith.
Absolutely. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and make sure we have enough time to talk about the scripture passage I'm actually preaching on. And so we're going to flip over to Matthew 13, and we're going to start in verse 24, and then we'll read through 30 and then jump over to 36, because we have another sort of situation as last week. So yesterday and the week, with the Monday before, we talked about, the parable of the sower, where, Jesus tells the parable out in the boat, and then, it goes on, and then they go into a house, and the disciples ask Jesus, what were you talking about there? We don't understand it. And Jesus explains the parable of the sower for them. We have a similar situation here where Jesus tells another parable, and then another couple, and then they say, tell us what does this parable that you're talking about mean? So we're going to read the parable of the weeds among the wheat, or the wheat and tares, and then so Matthew chapter 13, verse 24 through 30, and then 36 through 43. So Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. And then slipping over to verse 36. Then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seeds are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen.
And thus the grim reaper.
And thus the grim reaper. Yeah, it definitely sounds that way. Other first thoughts and ideas, questions? It's interesting that the landowner says, pull out the weeds first, after they're fully grown. Yeah, it is. And I don't know if you've ever seen a field of wheat, but that's difficult work because wheat grows so close together. I mean, you put it so close together to keep it standing up and make it easier to harvest. So, yeah.
Even now out here in our little gardens, I notice when you go to weed, there's some real sneaky weeds that go up right up next to the,
Yeah,
right
right.
so they're hard to get at and so forth,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that definitely becomes a harder point to weed and pull things out.
Verse 41 kind of scary. They will throw them into the fiery furnace and pull it out. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weep out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they're going to throw everybody out.
Well, yes. Yes, indeed. And again, for me, there's an interpretation of this parable that talks about not, we're one thing. I mean, again, yesterday I talked about how, it's not that we're the good soil or the rocky soil or the path, it's that we're all of it, we're the whole field. And for us, I would say that we are both the wheat and the tares. I mean, because that's the traditional take on it. Wheat and tares together sown unto joy or sorrow grown. I mean, we're actually singing that on Sunday. But that idea that we are both. There's both good fruit that we produce and also this weedy stuff. And that weedy stuff gets pulled out after it's all grown. And that stuff gets thrown into the fire and thrown away. So it's sort of that idea, that refiner's fire, that, You know, when you're working with a metal and you're trying to refine the gold down, what you do is you heat it up and heat it up, and the goss, the waste stuff burns off, and all you're left with is the gold. And so in our lives, there's good stuff, you know, because we've been made in the image of God, and that gets refined, that gets, you know, that gets saved, but the bad stuff gets burned off. Same thing here. The gnashing, the weeping and gnashing of teeth is us realizing our sins, seeing it in full display, and us being sad about that, us being distressed about the evil that we have done. Yeah, that's the weeping and gnashing of teeth, but that does get burned off so that the righteousness in us shines like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. So it's really interesting. Go ahead, Marty.
Does this have anything to do with like forgiveness?
Does this have anything to do with forgiveness? Absolutely. It has to do with forgiveness. It has to do with, you know, this is sort of that idea of purgatory, that the bad stuff gets pushed off. Now, you know, that's not in the Bible, so Protestants are like, eh. But that idea that, you know, the bad stuff gets worked away, that it gets cleared off, that becomes something that, you know, Protestants and Catholics can talk about. It's just, you know, what is the time frame? You know, Catholics talk about, well, you're in there forever until you finally get it worked out. Protestants are sort of like, boom, it's because of God's forgiveness that gets burned away, but still we end up experiencing that judgment. So, go ahead.
That's part of the confession.
Confession, yeah, absolutely. It's why we as Presbyterians do confession every single week. There's something that needs to get burned off, something that needs to get dropped, and we don't do a great job of it all the time, but we can do a little bit better. You know, we're never going to be free of sin this side of death.
So we're doing it all during our lifetime.
Yeah.
Basically not waiting.
Right, right, and knowing that we're never going to get there in this lifetime, but eventually, at the resurrection, we will. It's also interesting the way that, you know, they say, well, should we just go out and pull up the weeds right now? Should we just make everything perfect right now? And he's sort of like, no, you can't do that, because if you do, you're going to pull up some of the wheat too. So from God's perspective, there's no collateral damage allowed. You know, it's not like, oh, that's too bad that we accidentally, you know, killed 1 or 2 innocent civilians, but we took out this whole company of enemy troopers. For God, the loss of any good is not okay. And so this becomes something that is at least hopeful in my book, that God is not going to let goodness, that creation in God's image, slip away anywhere, that's going to continue to be saved and brought back.
Then what's the definition of a weed?
Then what's the definition of a weed? Well, the definition of weed is a plant out of context, but there's you know, there's plenty of times I've pulled purple coneflowers, even though they're pretty, because they aren't where I want them. But I think that this is a little bit different, that these tares are not edible.
Okay.
And they take up that space of what should be growing there. And what you have to be careful of is when you do that harvest, when you go out and you cut down the wheat, you don't want the weeds in there, because then you're going to grab out the seeds of the weeds, and then when you spread it out, you're going to have more weed seed growing, and weeds tend to outcompete what you're trying to get to grow. And so you have to do that. And then there's also the reason here for being the weeds being thrown into the fire, is the fire kills the seeds, and that's what you need to do. You need to burn them up so that the seeds don't continue to propagate. I mean, it's It's sort of like the dandelions. You pull up the dandelions before they flower because otherwise you're going to have seeds all over and more dandelions and more dandelions and more dandelions, because they're really good at outcompeting things. Sort of like sin. Sin is really good at outcompeting stuff. Barb,
It reminds me of us dropping the atomic bomb.
tell me more. So dropping the atomic bomb, how is that?
Well, that's just the people talk about, well, if we had done that, we wouldn't have won the war.
Right,
But think of the people
right.
that were,
There's collateral damage there,
Yes.
and God's not willing to do that. I mean, so thinking about the atomic bomb, yes, so Truman had to make the decision, we could have made Japan and have people go in, and there would be a huge loss of life on the American trooper side, but also Japanese civilians. So which is better? To drop the bomb, have them say, okay, we can't do this, we can't continue. And so you have, tens, hundreds of thousands of people die. And so from God's perspective, that's not okay. That collateral damage is never okay. What about the Old Testament? Oh, there's collateral damage all over the place. Yes, I agree. There are people that are harmed and hurt, and yeah, the Sodom and Gomorrah, those cities are wiped out. Yeah, there absolutely are. But again, here we hear about God and God's action in Jesus to have this, the wheat preserved, and not have, one. So because with them growing so close together, I mean, if you've ever been out to a wheat field, you pull one up, the roots are all tangled, and you're pulling up multiple plants. You can't just pull one out. And you can't tell the difference when it's first germinating to be able to do that, and to try to go through and pick out all these little things would be nearly impossible. So, but yeah, well, the wheat has to be Roundup ready, and it's not. So, anyway, Richard.
But on a smaller scale, in order for us to have a safer, let's say, society, we have laws and
Mhm.
I mean, how can we not try and at least make life better for those people that are innocent in this whole mess?
Right.
I just read a small article about a gunfight between the police and the guy that just killed some people, and the bad guy got shot by the cops.
Right.
I mean, it's a sad situation. We have 3 people dead, the victims, and then the perp. And I mean,
Right.
where does the justice all fit into this picture?
And that's exactly the question: is how does our sense of justice here in this partial sinful world take into account what God sees as justice? How does that correspond? And that's a harder question, because again, we live in a world that's permeated by sin. We don't know exactly how everything works out, and so we have to do the best we can. We're muddling along here. I mean, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to worry about the perpetrator with the gun, because that would have never happened. And it's
That's why in the Lord's Prayer we say, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done.
on earth as it is in heaven. Yeah.
Are we trying not to do that?
I mean, it's complicated. It's hard for us to, yeah, I mean, it's hard for us to figure this out and do this, because it's partial. What we understand of God is not complete, and how we act is not how God would have us act. And so I mean, if I'm being totally honest from my perspective, this becomes an argument against the death penalty. That if God is saying, keep the tares in with the wheat, and ultimately we'll separate it at the end, that to me says maybe the death penalty isn't the best option. Now, I understand that consideration of it's a deterrent, it helps people stay in line, and we also know that innocent people have been executed. And so,
Isn't there somewhere in scripture where it gives you authority to bear arms?
um,
I remember an old movie, Sergeant York,
yeah,
World War I, a Baptist, he was against violence, whatever, and somewhere he read this, now this was a movie, but he
Right.
read the scripture and it changed his mind.
and so that's where it becomes a complicated picture. Is, are we trying to save innocent lives? And there's definitely places that we are.
Wouldn't that be the case with the atomic bomb?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's the complex moral situation of which way are we saving more lives, and which lives are we prioritizing? And quite honestly, it could be that those actions did save more lives than they sacrificed. But again, in God's calculus, one life lost is too much. And so that becomes the complex world that we live in. That is not an easy, A plus B equals C. It's nonlinear geometry and, calculus all thrown into one that we can't fully figure out. And so from God's perspective, pulling out the evil ones before everything's come into, fruition isn't worth it, because you might damage something else. And I mean, if we go back to my understanding that we're both the weeds and the wheat, pulling out the weed in us also pulls out some of the good stuff, because they're so intertwined. And it's not until the end that can be judged. Because some of our, biggest flaws are also some of our greatest strengths and gifts.
By pulling off the weed, you get a stronger crop. Because
But if you pull out the weed, you pull out the wheat with it, because they're so intertwined. That's the problem. And so I guess an example, going back to our Old Testament passage, thinking about Jacob, that trickster, that also becomes a point of strength for him. I mean, so when he's dealt with unfairly by his father-in-law, by his uncle, he's able to, have the goats and the sheep mate in a certain way so that they become speckled, and so he gets all the speckled goats and the strongest of the speckled goats. And so he's, making choices in his flock, in his uncle's flock, to get himself a strong flock. So there's trickery there, but it also leads to blessing. And so it's that complex thing that, when we're looking at ourselves, those things that, we're a strong leader, that's great, except for the point that we have to follow. That our strengths, our biggest strengths, can also be our biggest liabilities when we're faced with alternate situations. And so when we're thinking about this, is that a wheat? Is that a tare? Don't know yet. It hasn't come to full fruition. And God's the one that ultimately has to decide. And we can't do that too early. Yeah, Ellie.
Something I'm struggling with how abortion fits into this.
How does abortion fit into this? I don't know. It's really tricky.
If you look at it from one standpoint, then you look at it from different angles.
Right, absolutely. I mean, from my perspective, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need to have abortion.
I guess that's what we all agree to think.
We wouldn't want,
We wouldn't need to have abortion in an ideal world. That every pregnancy would be safe
And wanted,
and wanted, and every pregnancy would bring, would have a child go to a home that has the resources needed to provide, adequate food and time and love and education and unfortunately that's not the world we live in right now.
But we do have agencies that will take.
Oh, absolutely,
children, obviously.
absolutely.
And I believe that, I think it's more the majority of those that do want to have some form of help for those that have a problem. I think the more interesting one comes when you have a child that, when you look at the ultrasound, you find out that the poor child is completely deformed, whatever.
Right.
And then the question becomes, all right, so the child comes into this world, how long is it going to survive?
Right. I mean, there's the question of how does that, where does that play out? I mean, I had my wife's cousin had, is it preeclampsia? She had something that made it so that her body was shutting down, and they had to end that pregnancy, or else they were going to lose both she and the child. And so this becomes really complex. And in an ideal world, we would have the medical knowledge to be able to say, okay, let's solve this before it becomes a problem. But there's just all this genetic variation, all these different things going on. Yeah. And so, again, complex situations, we don't know what it is, where things are going to go. So we have to leave it to God. We do the best we can, and we see what those things grow up into. I wish I had a nice, neat answer. I don't.
Well, we do the best we
It's why it's called faith, right?
We do the best we can.
Absolutely. We do the best we can, and we take hope that God was able to use Jacob.
Well,
I mean-
I would certainly want to save the mother.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. But we end up, it's complex, and we hope that God is going to use what God has in front of him. Use us in our strengths and gifts and our flaws and faults, and see where things go. Yeah, I'm not providing any answers. I know. Isn't that great? Just giving you more questions to sit with.
well, we have to live with ourselves too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, say that again.
There's so many hard choices.
Yes, there are hard choices, and I wish that they were easier, and they're just not.
And you have to live with what you've chosen.
There are consequences to choices. There absolutely are consequences. And that could be, is that a wheat or is it a tear? Is that the choice? How did it come to fruition? How did it flower? Is this something that can be used for people to eat? Is this something that feeds others? If it is, great. If not, then yeah, it needs to go in the fire so it doesn't keep on spreading. But I wouldn't put it as an individual. I mean, we are mixed bags. Jacob's a mixed bag. We are mixed bags. And so,
It kind of comes down to where you are in your life.
Mhm.
What choice you make and living with it. Perhaps you would have made a different choice.
absolutely.
You don't know until after the choice is over.
Absolutely. So, anyway. Thank you for this time, friends. It has felt like holy ground. And why don't we have our benediction and then we will head on to the rest of our day. May the Lord watch between me and thee while we are absent one from the other. Thank you, friends.
You have a beautiful voice.
Oh, thank you. I can try to find stuff that fits. That was something that just as I was doing my prep, it sort of jumped out. So yeah. Okay.